The emptiest place in the universe is the most active. The vacuum, the supposed nothing that fills the spaces between things, the void from which all matter is supposedly absent, turns out to be the most densely energetic state of physical reality that can be measured. There are particles appearing and disappearing in it constantly. There are fields fluctuating at every point in it, all the time, with energies that strain the ability of physics to compute. There are forces emerging from it that bend metal plates toward each other across distances of billionths of a meter. There is, by every measurement modern physics can make, no such thing as empty space. What classical intuition takes to be nothing is, in the framework that has dominated fundamental physics for the past century, the most extraordinary something the universe contains. And the implications of this fact, when followed seriously, change the way we have to think about being itself. For most of the history of human thought, the question of whether nothingness could exist was treated as a paradox to be avoided, rather than a fact to be investigated. Aristotle, in the 4th century before the Common Era, argued that nature abhors a vacuum. The void, in his physics, was an impossibility. There must always be something. The medieval European tradition, building on Aristotle through the long centuries of scholastic commentary, agreed there could be no genuinely empty region of space. The atomists, beginning with Democritus and Leucippus and continuing through Epicurus and Lucretius, disagreed in principle, holding that atoms moved through genuine emptiness. But even the atomist void was a passive backdrop, a stage on which the dance of matter unfolded, not itself an active participant. The classical conception of the vacuum, when one finally became standard in the 17th century, kept this passive character. Newton's space, Descartes' plenum, the various intermediate frameworks of early modern physics, all took for granted that wherever matter was not, nothing was. The vacuum was the absence of being. Whatever else it might be, it could not itself be the source of activity, structure, or substance. This picture began to crack in the early decades of the 20th century, and it broke open completely with the development of quantum mechanics and quantum field theory. The first hint came from the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, formulated by Werner Heisenberg in 1927. The principle states that certain pairs of physical quantities cannot simultaneously have definite values. The position and momentum of a particle, for example, are bound by the uncertainty relation in such a way that fixing one with perfect precision makes the other completely undetermined. The same relation holds, in a slightly different form, between energy and time. Over very short intervals, energy can fluctuate by amounts that the longer time conservation laws would forbid. What this implies for the vacuum is, when followed through, extraordinary. If the vacuum were truly empty, every field at every point would have to have a precisely zero value. But fields, like the electromagnetic field, behave like collections of harmonic oscillators, and harmonic oscillators cannot have a definite zero state in quantum mechanics. They must always have some minimum residual energy, what physicists call zero-point energy, even in their ground state. The classical vacuum, in which fields had zero value everywhere, is forbidden by the uncertainty principle. There must always be fluctuations. This was not a fringe idea. It was a direct consequence of taking quantum mechanics seriously, and the most rigorous physicists of the period accepted it as such. The earliest theoretical derivation of zero-point energy goes back to Max Planck in 1911, was developed further by Albert Einstein and Otto Stern in 1913, and was confirmed experimentally in studies of molecular spectra by Robert Mulliken at the University of Chicago in 1924. By the late 1920s, the existence of zero-point energy in quantum systems was established. What remained controversial, and remained controversial for decades, was whether to take seriously the implication that the vacuum itself, the supposed empty space of physics, was filled with these fluctuations. Some physicists, including Wolfgang Pauli, argued that the vacuum energy must be a mathematical artifact, that summing up the zero-point energies of all the modes of all the fields in space gave an answer so absurdly large that it could not possibly correspond to physical reality. Others, including Richard Feynman in his later writings, argued that the vacuum energy was real, even if its full implications were not yet understood. The resolution of this debate, when it came, was experimental. The first definitive experimental evidence for the active reality of the vacuum came from a measurement performed by Willis Lamb at Columbia University in 1947. Lamb, working with his graduate student Robert Rutherford, used techniques developed during the Second World War for radar to measure the energy levels of the hydrogen atom with unprecedented precision. The Dirac equation, which had governed the description of the hydrogen atom since 1928, predicted that two specific energy levels should be exactly equal. Lamb's measurements showed that they were not. There was a small but unmistakable difference, what came to be called the Lamb shift, that the existing theory could not account for. The explanation, worked out over the following years by Hans Bethe at Cornell University and refined by Julian Schwinger at Harvard, Sine Tiro Tomonaga in Tokyo, and Feynman at Cornell and later Caltech, traced the Lamb shift directly to the interaction of the bound electron with vacuum fluctuations. The electron, in its orbit around the proton, was not moving through empty space. It was being continuously jostled by the activity of the underlying electromagnetic field, and this jostling shifted its energy levels by amounts that matched Lamb's measurements to extraordinary precision. The vacuum, in other words, was doing something measurable. It was real enough to alter the structure of atoms. The work that grew out of these calculations became the foundation of quantum electrodynamics, the theory that has been called the most accurately tested theory in the history of physics. Feynman, Schwinger, and Tomonaga shared the Nobel Prize in 1965 for their development of the framework, and the heart of that framework, the source of its predictive power, was the recognition that the vacuum is not empty. It is a sea of activity in which virtual particles are continually appearing and disappearing, in which fields are continually fluctuating, in which interactions are continually being mediated by exchanges that have no classical counterpart. The success of QED in predicting, for example, the anomalous magnetic moment of the electron to 12 significant digits, an agreement between theory and experiment that exceeds anything in any other field of science, depends on taking the vacuum seriously as an active physical system. The electron, in QED, is constantly emitting and reabsorbing virtual photons, constantly exchanging virtual particles with the vacuum around it, and its measured properties reflect this ongoing exchange. To remove the vacuum from the calculation is to lose contact with the experimental reality of the electron itself. A second line of experimental evidence, equally striking and in some ways more direct, came from a prediction made by the Dutch physicist Hendrik Casimir at the Philips Research Laboratories in Eindhoven in 1948. Casimir, working with his colleague Dirk Polder on questions related to the van der Waals forces between atoms, calculated what would happen if you placed two perfectly conducting parallel plates very close together in vacuum. His result, when he worked it out, was startling. The plates would attract each other, not because of any force passing through them, not because of any radiation between them, but because of the structure of the vacuum itself. The fluctuations of the electromagnetic field that fill empty space cannot have arbitrary wavelengths between two conducting plates. The plates impose boundary conditions that exclude certain modes. The vacuum between the plates therefore has fewer fluctuations than the vacuum outside them. The asymmetry produces a net inward pressure. The plates are pushed toward each other by what is, in effect, the difference between the vacuum inside and the vacuum outside. Casimir's prediction sat as a theoretical curiosity for decades. The force was small. The experimental difficulties of measuring it precisely were enormous. The first attempt at measurement, by Marcus Sparnay at Phillips in 1958, gave results consistent with Casimir's prediction, but with large error bars. It was not until 1996 and 1997 that Stephen Lamoureux, then at Los Alamos National Laboratory and now at Yale, performed measurements precise enough to confirm the prediction unambiguously. Lamoureux's measurements, refined further by Umar Mohideen and Anushree Roy at the University of California, Riverside in 1998, agreed with Casimir's calculation to within a few percent. Subsequent work by Federico Capasso's group at Harvard and others has confirmed the effect across a wide range of geometries. The Casimir force is real. It is measurable. It can be used to actuate microelectromechanical devices. And what it measures directly is the difference in vacuum fluctuations between two regions of space. The vacuum, in Casimir's experiment, is exerting force on metal plates. Whatever it is not nothing. The picture that emerged from these developments, and that has been refined continuously over the decades since, is one in which the vacuum is the most fundamental physical object in the universe. Every field is in its vacuum state when no excitations are present, and the vacuum state of each field is filled with fluctuations. The electromagnetic field has its vacuum fluctuations, responsible for the Lamb shift, the Casimir effect, and the anomalous magnetic moment of the electron. The electron field has its vacuum fluctuations, in which virtual electron-positron pairs continually appear and disappear. The quark fields, the gluon fields, the weak boson fields, all of them have vacuum states populated by fluctuations whose effects can be measured in particle physics experiments. The total vacuum state of the universe is the joint vacuum of all these fields, an unimaginably rich substrate of activity at every point in space. Particles, in this framework, are excitations of fields above their vacuum states. They emerge from the vacuum, they propagate through the vacuum, and when they decay or annihilate, they return to it. The vacuum is not what is left when matter is absent. The vacuum is what matter is, in its undisturbed background mode. This conceptual shift from vacuum as absence to vacuum as substrate was deepened further by the discovery of phenomena that could not be explained without taking the vacuum structure seriously. One of the most consequential of these was the prediction by Stephen Hawking at Cambridge University in 1974 that black holes are not entirely black. Hawking, working out the implications of quantum field theory in the curved spacetime around a black hole, showed that virtual particle pairs forming near the event horizon would sometimes be separated by the horizon's geometry, with one member of the pair falling into the black hole and the other escaping to infinity. The escaping particle, from the perspective of a distant observer, would appear as thermal radiation emitted by the black hole. Hawking radiation, as it came to be called, has the consequence that black holes slowly evaporate. They are not eternal. They radiate energy into the surrounding space, and over enormously long timescales, they shrink and eventually disappear. The mechanism is entirely vacuum-driven. Without the constant fluctuation of the vacuum near the horizon, there would be no Hawking radiation. The very existence of an evaporation process for black holes depends on the recognition that empty space near a horizon is teeming with potential particles that the geometry can convert into actual ones. Hawking radiation has not yet been directly observed in astrophysical black holes because the temperatures involved are far too low for current detectors, but analog experiments using systems that share the relevant mathematical structure with the gravitational case, have confirmed the basic mechanism. Jeff Steinhauer at the Technion in Israel, working with Bose-Einstein, condensates that simulate the geometry of a horizon, has reported results consistent with the analog of Hawking radiation in 2014 and refined the measurements in subsequent years. The vacuum, when subjected to the right kind of geometric distortion, produces particles. This is not metaphor. This is laboratory measurement on systems that obey the same underlying equations as the gravitational case. And what it confirms is that the vacuum is not a passive backdrop but an active participant in the production of physical reality. The Higgs mechanism provides perhaps the most dramatic illustration of how the structure of the vacuum determines the structure of the visible world. The standard model of particle physics, developed over the 1960s and 1970s by a long list of contributors, including Peter Higgs at the University of Edinburgh, François Englert and Robert Brout at the Free University of Brussels, and Gerald Guralnik, CR. Hagen and Tom Kibble in 1964 requires a specific feature of the vacuum to make sense of the masses of fundamental particles. The proposal, in its essential form, is that the vacuum is filled with a field called the Higgs field, and that this field has a non-zero value everywhere, even in its lowest energy state. Particles that interact with the Higgs field acquire mass from this interaction. The more strongly they couple to the field, the more massive they appear. The masses of the W and Z bosons, the top quark, the bottom quark, and ultimately the electron and the other lighter particles, are all determined by the strength of their coupling to the field that fills the vacuum. This is a profound claim. It is the claim that the masses of particles, the most fundamental property of matter, are not intrinsic features of the particles themselves. They are interactions with the structure of empty space. Mass is something the vacuum gives to particles, not something particles bring with them. The mechanism was theoretical for nearly 50 years before it was experimentally confirmed. The confirmation came from the discovery of the Higgs boson, the excitation of the Higgs field, at the Large Hadron Collider at CERN in July 2012, by the ATLAS and CMS collaborations working independently. The discovery, announced with appropriate ceremony, confirmed the existence of the field whose presence in the vacuum gives mass to the particles of the standard model. Higgs and Englert shared the Nobel Prize in 2013 for the prediction. And the picture of the vacuum that this confirmed is one in which the most ordinary properties of matter, including the property of having mass at all, are gifts of the empty space that surrounds it. The vacuum, in this picture, is not just active, it is creative. It is what makes matter what it is. Without the Higgs field's non-zero value in the vacuum, the universe would have a completely different character. The electron would be massless. Atoms could not form. The chemistry that supports life would not exist. The features of the world we take for granted, including our own existence as material beings, depend on the specific structure that the vacuum happens to have. The vacuum is not a stage on which the drama of the universe unfolds. The vacuum is the deeper layer from which the drama emerges, in the specific form that the deeper layer makes possible. There is one further development that has to be brought into this picture, because it represents both the deepest confirmation of the vacuum's reality and the deepest puzzle about it. In 1998, two independent teams of astronomers, the High Z Supernova Search Team led by Adam Rias at Johns Hopkins University and the Supernova Cosmology Project led by Saul Perlmutter at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, made measurements of distant Type Ia supernovae that produced an unexpected result. The expansion of the universe, they found, was not slowing down as had been expected. It was speeding up. Some force was pushing the universe to expand faster, against the gravitational pull of all the matter it contained. Ries, Perlmutter, and Brian Schmidt of the Australian National University shared the Nobel Prize in 2011 for the discovery, which has been confirmed by many independent measurements since. And the leading candidate for the source of this acceleration is exactly what the structure of quantum field theory would lead one to expect: the energy of the vacuum itself, exerting a kind of negative pressure on spacetime that drives accelerated expansion. This appears, on its face, to be a beautiful confirmation of everything we have been describing. The vacuum has energy. The energy of the vacuum drives the large-scale evolution of the universe. The same substrate that produces Casimir forces in the laboratory shapes the cosmological history of all of space. But the situation is not as clean as this would suggest. When physicists try to calculate the actual energy density of the vacuum predicted by quantum field theory, they get a number that is enormously larger than the value implied by the observed acceleration of the universe. The discrepancy is not a small one. It is, by various estimates, somewhere between a factor of 10 to the 55th and 10 to the 120th, depending on how one performs the calculation. Steven Weinberg, the Nobel laureate at the University of Texas at Austin, called this the worst theoretical prediction in the history of physics in his influential review of the problem in 1989. The cosmological constant problem, as it is known, remains unsolved. The vacuum, the most directly measured substrate of physical reality, has properties at the cosmological scale that we do not understand. We can confirm its activity, we can measure its effects, but we cannot account for the magnitude of those effects within any framework currently available. The unsolved problem is not, however, a refutation of the picture. It is a deepening of the mystery. Whatever the vacuum is, it is doing things that exceed our current ability to model them. The activity is real, the effects are measurable, and the structure of the activity is, in many respects, exactly what quantum field theory leads us to expect. What is missing is a complete account of the vacuum's energy at the largest scales, an account that bridges between the vacuum that produces Casimir forces in the laboratory and the vacuum that drives the accelerated expansion of the cosmos. Many physicists believe that the resolution will require a deeper theory than we currently have, a quantum theory of gravity, or a modification of our understanding of how local quantum effects integrate to global cosmological ones. Whatever the resolution, it will not undo what we already know. The vacuum is real, the vacuum is active. The vacuum is the substrate from which matter, mass, force, and the geometry of space itself emerge. What this means, when fully assimilated, is something that ordinary intuition is not equipped to receive. You are not standing on solid ground. You are not surrounded by empty space. You are an excitation of fields whose ground state, the supposed nothing in which you exist, is the most densely energetic structure in the universe. The atoms in your body are localized excitations of the underlying matter fields. The forces between those atoms are mediated by virtual particles in the surrounding vacuum. The mass that gives your body its weight is acquired through interaction with the Higgs field that pervades the supposed empty space around you. Every property of every part of you depends, at the most fundamental level, on the fact that what you take to be empty is, in fact, the most full thing there is. The body you call yours is a temporary configuration of the same underlying activity that fills the seemingly empty regions between bodies. There is no separation between you and the vacuum. The vacuum is what you are made of. This is not metaphor. This is, in the framework that has dominated fundamental physics for the past century, a literal description of the situation. The shift is from a picture in which matter is the primary thing, with vacuum as the absence of matter, to a picture in which fields are the primary thing, with matter as a particular kind of disturbance of the fields and vacuum as the undisturbed state of the same fields. In this picture, vacuum and matter are two modes of the same underlying reality. They are not different things. They are different conditions of the same things. The vacuum is the field at rest. Matter is the field excited, and the excitations come and go while the fields themselves remain. There is something almost shocking about this description when it is allowed to land. The fundamental layer of reality on this account is not stuff, it is fields, and the fields have a permanent ground state that is full of activity. Stuff, the matter we encounter in everyday life, the bodies and objects and worlds, is what happens when the fields are disturbed in particular ways. The disturbances are temporary. They appear, they propagate, they interact, they decay. The fields are, in the relevant sense, eternal. They were here before any particular star formed. They will be here after every star has burned out. The patterns that arise within them, including all the patterns that constitute matter and life and consciousness, are fluctuations of something that itself is the more permanent thing. To be a material object, to be a body, to be a self with a body, is to be a particular kind of excitation of a substrate, that is, even when no excitation is present, in a state of constant fluctuation. The vacuum, then, is not what is left when reality is removed. The vacuum is reality in its most fundamental mode, and the appearance of emptiness, when one looks at a region of space where no matter happens to be present, is a misperception of what is actually there. What is actually there is the same fields that, when excited, become the matter we know. The fields are doing something, even when they are not excited into particles. They are fluctuating. They are exchanging virtual particles. They are mediating forces. They are giving mass to whatever passes through them. The emptiness is not empty. The emptiness is the ground from which everything emerges, and to which everything returns when its particular pattern of excitation runs out. Something about this picture would have been deeply familiar to certain ancient contemplative traditions, which, by entirely different methods and from entirely different starting points, arrived at structurally similar conclusions about the nature of being. The Taoist sage Lao Tzu, in the 11th chapter of the Tao Te Ching, composed in China sometime in the 6th or 5th century before the Common Era, gave a famous illustration of his philosophical point. 30 spokes share one hub, he wrote. It is the hole in the middle that makes the wheel useful. Clay is shaped into a vessel. It is the emptiness inside that makes the vessel useful. Doors and windows are cut to make a room. It is the empty space that makes the room useful. The point Lao Tzu was making was not narrowly architectural, it was metaphysical. The useful and creative aspect of things in Taoist thought is what is empty in them. The full, the substantial, the manifest, exists in service of the empty, which is what gives the manifest its capacity to be anything at all. The vessel, without an interior cavity, is no vessel. The wheel without a hub is no wheel. The room without empty space is not a room. Emptiness, in this analysis, is not the absence of being. It is what makes being functional, what makes being useful, what makes being a particular kind of thing rather than a meaningless lump. The Taoist intuition that emptiness has a creative role in the constitution of things runs through the entire tradition. The Tao itself is described in chapter 4 of the Tao Te Ching as empty, and yet inexhaustible in its use, a deep pool from which all things issue forth. The fundamental ground of reality, in Taoist thought, is precisely what cannot be filled because it is not a thing that could be filled, but is rather the source from which the things that can be filled and emptied draw their existence. 2,500 years before Casimir measured the force exerted by the vacuum between two metal plates, Lao Tzu was pointing out that what enables the wheel to turn is not the spokes, but the emptiness at the hub. The structural parallel, when it is allowed to stand without strain, is striking. Emptiness, in the Taoist framework, is what makes existence possible. Emptiness, in modern physics, is what existence is made of. A different but related framework was developed in India by the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna in the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era. Nagarjuna, the founder of the Madhyamaka school of Mahayana Buddhism, devoted his major work, the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, to a sustained philosophical analysis of the concept of shunyata, often translated as emptiness, but more accurately rendered as something like absence of independent essence. Nagarjuna's argument was that nothing has an independent self-existence. Everything exists only in relation to other things, dependent on conditions, lacking any intrinsic core that could be isolated and pointed to as the thing itself. The bottle exists only as the conjunction of its glass, its shape, its history of being made, the air it contains, the hand that holds it, the eyes that see it. No element of this conjunction is, by itself, the bottle. The bottle is what arises when the conditions are right, and it dissolves when the conditions are not. This is what shunyata means. Not that nothing exists, but that nothing exists independently. Everything is empty of self-nature. And this emptiness is not the absence of reality. It is the very fabric from which reality is woven. The structural pattern that connects everything to everything else, in Nagarjuna's analysis, is the pattern of emptiness, the pattern of mutual dependent origination, the pattern of arising and ceasing that has no underlying substance to hold it in place, but is, instead, all there is. The most famous expression of this insight in Buddhist literature is the line from the Heart Sutra, a short text whose composition is uncertain, but which became central to East Asian Buddhism. Form is emptiness, the sutra states. Emptiness is form. The line is not a paradox to be resolved, but a recognition of identity. What appears as form, as manifested existence, is empty in the precise sense of lacking independent self-nature. What is empty in this sense is what manifests as form. The two are not opposites that have to be reconciled. They are aspects of the same situation, viewed from different angles. The structural parallel to the modern picture of fields and excitations is, again, hard to ignore. Form, the manifested particle, is empty in the sense that it has no existence apart from the field that supports it. The field, the underlying emptiness in this analogy, is what appears as form when conditions excite it into a particular configuration. Form is field excited, field is form at rest. The traditions that elaborated these insights did not have laboratories. They did not have measurements of the Casimir effect, or the Lamb shift, or the cosmological constant. What they had was attention, sustained over centuries, to the actual structure of experience and the actual structure of phenomena as they appear in experience. What they noticed when they paid attention was that the things they encountered did not have the kind of self-contained, substantial existence that ordinary perception attributes to them. The things were dependent. The things were empty in this specific philosophical sense, and the emptiness, far from being a frightening void, was the very thing that allowed manifestation to occur. Modern physics, working from entirely different premises and using entirely different methods, has now arrived at a structurally similar picture. The vacuum, the supposed nothing, is what makes things possible. The fields, the empty backgrounds, are what manifestation is. To say that the vacuum is full of activity, in the modern physical sense, is to say something that the contemplative traditions had been attempting to articulate for 2.5 millennia. The convergence is not a forced parallel. It is a recognition, from very different starting points of the same structural fact about how reality is organized. What we have then, at the end of this first inquiry, is a picture in which the most basic conception of nothingness, the picture of empty space as a passive backdrop to material reality, has been overturned. Empty space is not empty. Empty space is the most active and most generative substrate in the universe. It is what gives mass to particles. It is what mediates forces. It is what produces radiation near horizons. It is what drives the accelerated expansion of the cosmos. And it has, on the most rigorous physical analyses available, properties whose magnitudes we cannot yet fully account for, properties that suggest there is more to be discovered about the structure of being at its deepest level than we currently understand. The questions this leaves us with are profound. If matter is excitation of fields, and the fields exist in a permanent ground state of activity that itself is not matter, what is the relationship between what we ordinarily call existence and the deeper substrate from which it emerges? If the vacuum has structure, if it has geometry, if it has information content, what is the nature of this structure, and how does it relate to the manifest world? If the contemplative traditions, working purely from the inside through attention to the structure of experience, arrived at descriptions of reality that resemble in striking ways what physics is now describing from the outside, through measurement, what does this convergence tell us about the relationship between mind and world? These are the questions the inquiries to come will pursue. We will go deeper into the geometry and information structure of the vacuum, into the proposals that space and time themselves emerge from something more fundamental, into the holographic and entanglement-based pictures of reality that suggest the substrate has properties even stranger than the ones we have so far described. We will examine in detail what the contemplative traditions said about emptiness, in their own words and in their own frameworks, and consider what their insights mean alongside the physical picture. And we will return, at the end, to the question of what all of this means for you, the particular pattern of excitation reading these words, the particular configuration of fields that has temporarily organized itself into the form of a self. What you take to be empty is not empty. What you take to be solid is not solid in the way you think. The matter of your body is excitation. The space around your body is substrate. The boundary between you and what you are not is not a boundary in being, but a boundary in mode. You and the world around you are different conditions of the same underlying reality. The supposed empty space that surrounds you is the same kind of thing as you, in a different state. And the deeper layer that holds both, the layer from which both you and the apparently empty space around you emerge as particular configurations, is the most extraordinary fact about the universe that physics has yet uncovered. What it is, what it can do, and what its existence means for the question of what we are the inquiries we are now ready to take up. The vacuum is not just full, the vacuum has a shape. It has a geometry that fluctuates at scales too small to see, an information structure that may turn out to be more fundamental than the geometry itself, and an organization whose discovery has forced physics into a strange new territory in which space and time are not the basic ingredients of reality, but emergent features of something deeper. The picture that has been developing across theoretical physics for the past several decades is one in which the apparent emptiness of space is, at the deepest level we can currently probe, the surface manifestation of a structured underlying reality. The fluctuations are not random noise, they have patterns. The patterns are not arbitrary, they encode information. And the information, when followed to its consequences, may turn out to be what space, time, and matter all are, at the level beneath every level we have so far investigated. This shift, from vacuum as energetic substrate to vacuum as informational and geometric substrate, began with the work of John Archibald Wheeler at Princeton University in the middle of the 20th century. Wheeler, who would later coin the phrase black hole and who taught Richard Feynman as a graduate student, was one of the boldest theoretical imaginations of the post-war era. In a series of papers and discussions beginning in 1955, Wheeler proposed that at the smallest scales accessible to physical theory, the scales given by combinations of the gravitational constant, Planck's constant, and the speed of light, the smooth geometry of space-time that classical relativity describes, must give way to something far more turbulent. At distances of about 10 to the negative 35th of a meter, the so-called Planck length, the energy density of vacuum fluctuations becomes large enough that, by the equivalence of mass and energy in general relativity, the geometry of space-time itself should be deformed. Wheeler called the picture quantum foam. At the deepest level, space is not smooth. It is a roiling foam of geometric fluctuations, microscopic black holes appearing and disappearing, wormholes opening and closing, topological structures forming and dissolving on timescales too short to register at any larger scale. The picture is hard to visualize because the scales involved are so far below ordinary experience. The Planck length is to the diameter of an atom what the diameter of an atom is to the size of the observable universe. At those scales, the very concepts of position and distance begin to lose their classical meaning. There is no smooth manifold for points to be located on. There is instead a fluctuating substrate whose statistical properties give rise to the smooth geometry of larger scales, the way the statistical properties of molecular motion give rise to the smooth flow of fluids. Just as water appears continuous to ordinary perception even though it is made of discrete molecules in chaotic motion, space-time appears continuous to large-scale physics even though, on Wheeler's hypothesis, it is at the deepest level a fluctuating quantum foam. The vacuum, in this picture, is not merely the ground state of fields living on a fixed background of space and time. The vacuum is also the ground state of space and time themselves. Geometry is one of the things that fluctuates. Wheeler took this insight further into a research program he called Geometrodynamics, developed most fully in his 1962 work with collaborators including Charles Misner. The radical idea behind geometrodynamics was that everything physical might ultimately be reducible to geometry. Matter, in this view, is not something separate from space-time that lives within it. Matter might be specific topological structures of space-time itself. An electron might be a particular kind of knot in the fabric of geometry. A nucleus might be a different topological configuration. The forces between particles might be features of how the underlying geometry connects them. The vacuum, on this view, is not just a substrate populated by matter. The vacuum is what matter is, in its undisturbed mode. Matter is what happens when the geometry of the vacuum forms certain stable patterns. Wheeler's program in this strong form was never fully realized. The mathematics turned out to be more difficult than the early attempts could handle, and quantum field theory developed along somewhat different lines. But the underlying intuition that the apparent diversity of physical phenomena might reduce to features of a single underlying geometric or informational substrate has remained one of the most powerful ideas in fundamental physics, and it is currently undergoing a major revival. The revival began with a discovery about black holes that, when its implications were fully worked out, transformed the way physicists think about the relationship between space, matter, and information. The discovery had two parts. The first part came from Jacob Bekenstein at Princeton, working as a graduate student under Wheeler in 1972 and 1973. Bekenstein proposed that black holes have entropy, and that the entropy is proportional not to the volume of the black hole but to the area of its event horizon. this was already a strange result. Entropy, in ordinary thermodynamics, scales with the volume of a system. A box of gas has entropy proportional to the number of molecules inside, which scales with the volume of the box. But for a black hole, Bekenstein argued, the entropy should scale with the area of the boundary, not the volume of the interior. The information content of a black hole, on this proposal, is somehow encoded on its surface rather than distributed through its interior. The second part of the discovery came from Stephen Hawking in 1974 and 1975, with his calculation that black holes radiate thermally, with a specific temperature and entropy that confirmed Bekenstein's proposal. The Bekenstein-Hawking entropy formula, which gives the entropy of a black hole as 1/4 the area of its event horizon in units of the Planck length squared, has stood as one of the most important and puzzling results in theoretical physics for half a century. The puzzlement is not that the formula is wrong, but that it is right. If black holes are physical objects, and their information content is bounded by their surface area rather than their volume, this implies something profound about how information is stored in space generally. Ordinary intuition says that the maximum information content of any region of space should scale with the volume of the region. There is, after all, more room in a larger volume for more information to be stored. But the black hole result implies that this intuition is mistaken. There is a maximum information density associated with any region of space, and this maximum is set not by the volume but by the boundary area. If a region were filled with so much information that it exceeded its surface area bound, the region would, by general relativistic arguments, collapse into a black hole, and the information would end up encoded on the black hole's horizon, which has the area determined by the volume's surface. The surface, in other words, is the fundamental container of information. The volume is, in some sense, that physics has been trying to articulate ever since, derivative. This insight was given its most complete formulation in 1993 by Gerard Hooft at Utrecht University, and developed further in 1995 by Leonard Susskind at Stanford University. The proposal, which they called the holographic principle, is that the information content of any region of space is fully captured by a description living on the boundary of that region. The volume of space is, in this sense, a kind of hologram. Just as a two-dimensional holographic plate, when illuminated correctly, produces a three-dimensional image, the lower dimensional boundary of a region of spacetime contains all the information needed to reconstruct what is happening inside. The holographic principle is not a vague analogy. It is a precise mathematical claim about the relationship between bulk physics and boundary physics, and it has, since its proposal, been confirmed in specific theoretical settings with remarkable rigor. The most important confirmation came in 1997 from a young Argentine physicist named Juan Maldacena, who was then at Harvard University and who later moved to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Maldacena's paper, titled The Large N Limit of Superconformal Field Theories and Supergravity, established what has come to be called the ADS, CFT correspondence. The technical content of the paper is dense, but the central claim is, when stated plainly, extraordinary. Maldacena showed that a particular theory of gravity in a five-dimensional curved spacetime called anti-de Sitter space is mathematically equivalent to a particular four-dimensional quantum field theory living on the boundary of that space. The two theories, despite operating in different numbers of dimensions and being formulated in completely different mathematical languages, describe exactly the same physics. Every gravitational phenomenon in the bulk has a corresponding non-gravitational description on the boundary, and every quantum process on the boundary corresponds to some gravitational configuration in the bulk. The bulk and the boundary are not two separate physical systems. They are two ways of describing the same system. The ADS CFT correspondence has been studied intensively for nearly 3 decades, and its detailed predictions have been confirmed across a wide range of calculations. It has become one of the most fertile theoretical frameworks in modern physics, used to investigate everything from the dynamics of quark-gluon plasma to the thermodynamics of black holes to the conditions of the early universe. And what it establishes, beyond reasonable dispute within the relevant theoretical contexts, is that the holographic principle is not merely a speculation. There exist consistent physical theories in which a higher dimensional bulk spacetime, with its full structure of geometry and matter, is exactly equivalent to a lower dimensional boundary description without gravity at all. Geometry, in these theories, is not fundamental. Geometry emerges from the patterns of information on the boundary. What this means, when the implications are taken seriously, is that the vacuum may have informational content that is more fundamental than its geometric content. The shape of space, the curvature that we associate with gravity, the very dimensionality of the universe we inhabit, may all be derivative features of an underlying informational structure. The vacuum is not just full of energy, the vacuum is full of information, and the information has organizational properties that determine, at the deepest level, we can currently probe what the geometry of space and time is. This insight has been developed further in the past 15 years through work that connects the holographic principle to quantum entanglement in a way no one anticipated when ADS CFT was first proposed. The key contribution came from Mark van Ramsdonk at the University of British Columbia in a 2010 paper titled Building Up Spacetime with Quantum Entanglement. Van Ramsdonk asked a simple question. Within the ADS CFT framework, what determines whether two regions of the bulk spacetime are connected, in the sense of being part of the same continuous geometry? His answer, when he worked it out, was that the connection between two regions is determined by the entanglement between the corresponding regions on the boundary. If the boundary regions are highly entangled, the bulk regions are connected by a smooth piece of spacetime. If the boundary regions are not entangled, the bulk regions are not part of the same connected geometry. They are, in a precise sense, geometrically disconnected. To take this further, Van Ramsdonk showed that as you continuously decrease the entanglement between two boundary regions, the corresponding bulk regions are pulled apart. The geometry between them stretches and thins, and at zero entanglement, they have separated entirely. Space-time, on this picture, is held together by entanglement. Without entanglement, there is no connected geometry. This is one of the most striking results in recent theoretical physics. Space-time, the very stage on which physics has always been thought to play out, turns out to be derivative of something more fundamental. What is fundamental is the pattern of quantum entanglement among the degrees of freedom on the boundary, or equivalently, the informational correlations among the parts of the underlying substrate. Geometry is the macroscopic appearance of this entanglement structure. When the entanglement is rich and complex, the geometry is connected and smooth. When the entanglement is sparse, the geometry breaks apart. The vacuum, in this picture, is the maximally entangled state of the boundary degrees of freedom, and the smooth space-time we observe is the bulk reflection of that entanglement. The picture was sharpened further in 2013 by Juan Maldacena and Leonard Susskind in a paper titled Cool Horizons for Entangled Black Holes. Their proposal, which has come to be known by the shorthand ER equals EPR, identifies two apparently separate concepts in physics that, as it turns out, may be the same concept seen from different angles. ER refers to Einstein-Rosen bridges, the wormhole solutions of general relativity that Einstein and Nathan Rosen described in 1935 as theoretically possible connections between distant regions of space. EPR refers to Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen entanglement, the quantum correlations that Einstein, Boris Podolsky and Rosen, also in 1935, identified as a peculiar feature of quantum mechanics that allows distant particles to share a non-classical relationship. For decades, these two concepts seem to belong to entirely different domains. Wormholes are objects of classical general relativity, geometric configurations of spacetime. Entanglement is a feature of quantum mechanics, a correlation among states. Maldacena and Susskind propose that they are, at the deepest level, the same thing. Whenever two systems are entangled, they are connected by a microscopic wormhole. The geometric connection of spacetime, in this view, is the macroscopic manifestation of microscopic quantum entanglement. The ER equals EPR conjecture has been pursued intensively in the years since. Detailed calculations in specific theoretical models have confirmed many of its predictions. The deeper picture it suggests, in which all of space-time is a vast network of entanglement, has been developed by many physicists, including Brian Swingle at the University of Maryland, who showed in 2009 how holographic geometries can be built up from quantum tensor networks, structures that explicitly encode entanglement patterns. Benny Yoshida, Daniel Harlow, John Preskill, and Fernando Pastowski showed in 2015 that holographic encoding can be understood as a quantum error-correcting code, with the bulk geometry serving as the redundant encoding of boundary information. The framework is now sufficiently developed that physicists routinely speak of spacetime as emergent from entanglement, and many theoretical investigations of black holes, cosmology, and the foundations of quantum gravity proceed on the assumption that this is the right way to think about the underlying structure of reality. The picture that emerges from this body of work is one in which the most fundamental layer of physics is not made of particles, not made of fields, not even made of spacetime, but made of information and the patterns of correlation among informational degrees of freedom. The vacuum, in this picture, is the state of maximum coherent entanglement among these degrees of freedom, and everything else in the universe is a particular pattern of excitation or modification of that fundamental entangled state. Particles are localized excitations. Fields are continuous distributions of excitations. Spacetime geometry is the macroscopic manifestation of entanglement structure. Mass, charge, and other physical properties are features of how excitations interact with the underlying substrate. The substrate itself, the deeper layer beneath all of these manifestations, is informational in character. It is not made of stuff in any classical sense. It is a pattern of relationships, a structure of distinctions, an organization of bits. This brings us back to a proposal that John Wheeler, who first imagined the quantum foam, articulated in his later years as the deepest hypothesis he had been able to formulate. In a 1989 paper titled Information, Physics, Quantum, The Search for Links, Wheeler put forward what he called the it from bit hypothesis. Every entity in the physical world, derives its existence from binary distinctions, from yes or no answers to physical questions. The fundamental layer of reality, Wheeler proposed, is not material at all. It is informational. The world is built up from distinctions, and the distinctions are what is fundamental. Matter, energy, space, time, all of these are particular ways of structuring information. Wheeler did not live to see the full development of the holographic and entanglement-based pictures that have emerged in the years since. But the trajectory of theoretical physics has, in many respects, move toward exactly the position he sketched. The substrate of reality is informational. Geometry, matter, and the rest are derivative. Erik Verlinde at the University of Amsterdam, in a series of papers beginning in 2010 and continuing through 2016, has pushed this insight further by arguing that gravity itself is not a fundamental force, but an emergent thermodynamic phenomenon arising from changes in entanglement entropy. On Verlinde's account, what we observe as gravitational attraction is a statistical effect, comparable to how the elasticity of a polymer is a statistical effect of molecular configurations rather than a fundamental force at the molecular level. Verlinde's proposals are controversial. Not all of them have survived detailed scrutiny, but the broader research program, in which gravity, geometry, and even the dimensionality of spacetime are emergent features of a deeper informational substrate, has substantial support across the theoretical physics community and continues to generate new results. What does all of this mean for our understanding of the vacuum? It means that the vacuum is not just full of energy and not just full of geometric fluctuations. The vacuum is full of information, organized into specific patterns of entanglement, and this information is what space, time, and matter ultimately are. The apparent emptiness of empty space is, at the deepest level, the manifestation of a richly structured informational substrate in which everything we observe as physical reality is derivative. The vacuum is not the absence of being. The vacuum is the most informationally complex state in the universe, and everything that exists is a particular pattern of organization within it. The substrate is not nothing. The substrate is, in a precise sense, the modern theoretical frameworks are still working to articulate, the ground from which all distinctions emerge. This recognition has consequences that exceed what physics has so far been able to formulate explicitly. If the vacuum is the source of geometry, the source of mass, the source of forces, and the source of the very informational structure that gives rise to the manifest world, then the vacuum is not a place. It is not a region of space. It is, more accurately, what every region of space is at its deepest level. And the relationship between any particular thing and the underlying vacuum is not the relationship of a thing to its environment. It is the relationship of a particular pattern to the substrate from which it has been formed. You are not in the vacuum. You are the vacuum, in a particular configured state. Your apparent separateness from the empty space around you is a feature of how the patterns of excitation that constitute your body are localized relative to the patterns that are not so localized. The substrate is the same throughout. What differs is only the mode of its organization at different points. There is something almost vertiginous about this when it is allowed to land. The substrate is not somewhere else. It is here, now, as the deepest layer of what you are. The empty space between the atoms of your body is the same kind of thing as the empty space between distant galaxies. The fields that fluctuate in the room around you are the same fields whose excitations gave rise to the matter in stars billions of light years away. The information patterns that organize the atoms in your skull are continuous, at the deepest level, with the information patterns that organize everything else in the universe. There is no place where the substrate stops and you begin. There is, instead, a continuous substrate with various local configurations, one of which happens to be reading these words right now. This picture, when followed seriously, makes available a different way of thinking about what existence is. To exist, on this view, is not to be a separate thing in a containing space. To exist is to be a particular pattern of organization within a substrate that is itself the deeper reality from which all patterns emerge. The patterns are real. They have measurable properties. They interact with other patterns in ways that physics describes with extraordinary precision. but the patterns are not independent of the substrate. They are not floating on top of nothing, sustained by their own internal coherence. They are local configurations of an underlying field of information whose organization is what allows them to be at all. Long before any of this was articulated in the language of quantum field theory or holographic principles or entanglement-based pictures of space-time, contemplative traditions in several cultures had arrived at structurally similar pictures of the deepest layer of reality. The pictures were not arrived at through measurement. They were arrived at through sustained attention to the structure of being itself, often through practices of contemplative inquiry that took generations to develop. What these traditions found, when they pushed their inquiry to its deepest point, was that the source of all manifestation was not a thing among other things, not a being among other beings, not even a being at all in the ordinary sense. The source was something that could not be captured in any of the categories used to describe manifest reality, because it was the substrate from which those categories themselves emerged. Meister Eckhart, the German Dominican who taught and preached in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, developed perhaps the most rigorous medieval European articulation of this insight. Eckhart distinguished, in his sermons and treatises, between Gott, God, in the ordinary theological sense, and Gottheit, the Godhead, the deeper layer that lies, in some sense, beyond God himself. Gott is the God of personal relationship, the God to whom one prays, the God who creates the world and acts within it. Gottheit is the abyss from which Gott emerges, the silent ground that is not itself a being but is the source of all being, including the being of God in his manifested aspect. Eckhart called this deeper layer by various names, including the desert, the abyss, the silent wasteland of the divine. He used the word Wüst, the wilderness, to capture its character as a place not of comforting presence but of an emptiness that was the source of everything. And he insisted, in passages that troubled the church authorities of his time and led to his posthumous condemnation, that the soul in its deepest part touches not Gott but Gottheit, that the deepest contact in mystical experience is with the silent ground and not with the personal God who arises from it. The structural parallel to the modern physical picture is striking. There is the manifested world, with its particular patterns and configurations, the equivalent of Gott in Eckhart's framework, the equivalent of geometry and matter and force in the physical framework. And there is the deeper substrate from which the manifested world arises, the equivalent of Gottheit in Eckhart, the equivalent of the informational vacuum in physics. The deeper substrate is not itself a thing among the things of the manifested world. It is the source from which those things derive. Eckhart's claim was not that Gott is unreal, it was that Gott is derivative. The deepest reality is the silent ground, and the soul, when it pushes its inquiry to the most fundamental level, finds itself face to face not with a personal being, but with a substrate whose nature exceeds all the categories of being. This kind of language, of a deeper layer beyond what can ordinarily be described, has its more rigorous theological development in the apophatic tradition of Christian thought, which traces its origins to a body of writings produced in the late 5th or early 6th century under the pseudonym Dionysius the Areopagite. Pseudo-Dionysius, as scholars now refer to this anonymous author, developed a sustained framework for talking about the deepest layer of reality by saying, with increasing rigor, what it is not. The author used the term hyperousios, sometimes translated as superessential or beyond being, to refer to the divine source. The point was not that the source is less than being. The point was that the source is what makes being possible, and that the categories of being therefore do not apply to it. To say the source exists is to put it on the same level as the things that exist by deriving from it, which is a category mistake. To say the source does not exist is also a category mistake, because non-existence is also a category that derives from the source. The proper way to refer to the source is, on this view, through systematic negation. The source is not this, the source is not that. The negations are not denials of reality, but recognitions that the reality of the source exceeds the reality of any of the things that are being negated. This apophatic framework, developed across centuries by John Scotus Eriugena, Gregory of Nyssa, Maximus the Confessor, and the anonymous English author of the 14th century work The Cloud of Unknowing, articulated a position that has clear structural parallels to the modern physical understanding of the substrate. The substrate, in physics, is not a thing among the things it gives rise to. It is the deeper layer from which they emerge. The categories that apply to the manifested world, the categories of geometry, matter, force, location, do not apply in the same way to the underlying informational substrate. To describe the substrate, physics has had to develop new vocabularies, new mathematical structures, new ways of talking about something that is not a thing in the ordinary sense, but is what makes things possible. The contemplative apophatic tradition was, in its own different way, doing the same work. It was developing a vocabulary for talking about what cannot be talked about in ordinary terms, because what cannot be talked about in ordinary terms is what makes ordinary things possible at all. A related insight was articulated in a different cultural and religious context by the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, particularly in the framework developed by Isaac Luria in the 16th century at Safed. Luria, working out of the older Kabbalistic framework while developing it in radical new directions, proposed that the act of creation could not be understood as God making something out of nothing in an external space. There was no external space. God filled all of being. For there to be anything other than God, God had to first contract, to withdraw, to make room. This act of contraction, called Tzimtzum, was the fundamental cosmological event in Lurianic Kabbalah. By contracting, God created an empty space within himself, a void in which finite creation could come into being. The empty space was not empty in the sense of being absolutely nothing. It was empty in the sense of being the cleared region within the divine plenitude where finite forms could manifest. Creation, in this framework, occurs within an emptiness that is itself the result of divine self-limitation, an emptiness that is the precondition for there being a finite world at all. The structural parallel to the modern physical picture is, again, hard to ignore. The vacuum, in modern physics, is not absolute nothing. It is the substrate from which manifested existence emerges. It is, in some sense, the cleared field within the deeper reality of the underlying informational structure where particular patterns can manifest. The vacuum is the precondition for there being any localized excitation at all. Without the substrate, there would be nothing to be excited. Without the substrate's structured organization, there would be no possibility of the specific patterns we observe as matter and energy. The substrate is, in this precise sense, what makes the world possible. These three frameworks, the Eckhartian distinction between Gott and Gothite, the apophatic tradition's use of hyperousios, and the Lurianic concept of Tzimtzum, are not equivalent to one another, and they are not equivalent to the modern physical picture. They emerged from different cultures, served different theological purposes, and were developed using different conceptual tools. What they share, despite these differences, is a recognition that the deepest layer of reality cannot be understood by extending the categories that apply to the surface of reality. The deepest layer is, in some sense, each tradition articulates differently, beyond what can be said about the things that derive from it. And the modern physical picture, working from entirely different premises and using entirely different methods, has arrived at a structurally similar recognition. The substrate that gives rise to space, time, and matter is not itself describable in the language of space, time, and matter. It requires its own vocabulary, its own mathematical structures, its own ways of being approached. What the convergence of these frameworks suggests, when their structural similarities are taken seriously, is that the deepest inquiry into the nature of reality, whether pursued through physical measurement and mathematical theory, or through contemplative attention and theological refinement, points beyond the manifested world toward a substrate that the manifested world is a particular configuration of. The substrate is not nothing. The substrate is not another thing alongside the things of the manifested world. The substrate is what those things are, in their deeper aspect. And the relationship between the manifested world and the substrate is not the relationship between a thing and its environment, but the relationship between a pattern and the field within which the pattern arises. This recognition, when it is allowed to settle, changes the texture of how one thinks about the most basic features of existence. The space around you is not empty. The space around you is the same substrate that, when configured differently, becomes the matter of your body. The substrate has properties that exceed what current physics can fully describe. The substrate has information content. The substrate has organizational structures whose patterns determine the particular features of the manifested world. And the substrate, on the convergent witness of multiple contemplative traditions, has a character that the language of ordinary experience cannot capture. It is, in its own different vocabularies, the silent ground from which all manifestation emerges, the deep wilderness that is more fundamental than any particular thing, the cleared field within which the world becomes possible. What this substrate is, what its nature is, what relationship a finite manifested being like yourself stands into it, is the deepest question any inquiry into the structure of reality can pose. The contemplative traditions have been pursuing this question for thousands of years. The physics is now circling toward the same territory from the other direction. And what awaits, in the next inquiry, is the body of contemplative analysis that took the question further than anyone working purely from the outside has yet been able to go. Long before any laboratory could measure the activity of the vacuum, before there was any mathematical framework for describing how information might be encoded on the boundary of a region of space, before any of the conceptual machinery of modern physics had been developed, contemplative thinkers in widely separated cultures had arrived, through entirely different methods, at insights that bear striking structural resemblance to what physics is now articulating in its own technical vocabulary. The methods used were not measurement and computation. The methods used were sustained attention to the nature of being itself, often through practices of contemplative inquiry that took generations to develop, and that demanded a kind of rigor different from, but no less exacting, than the rigor of empirical science. What these thinkers found, when they pushed their inquiry to its deepest point, was that the manifest world is not the foundation of reality. The manifest world emerges from a substrate that cannot be described in the categories of the manifest world itself. The substrate is not nothing. The substrate is, in the various technical vocabularies these traditions developed, an emptiness that is also the source of all fullness. The convergence between this contemplative recognition and the modern physical picture of vacuum and substrate is one of the most remarkable facts about the history of human inquiry into the nature of being. The most explicit and philosophically rigorous treatment of emptiness as the source of manifestation comes from the Buddhist Madhyamaka tradition, founded in India in the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era by the philosopher Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna, who was born in southern India and is associated with the great monastic university of Nalanda, devoted his major work, the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, to a sustained dialectical analysis of the central concept that came to define the school he founded. The concept is shunyata, which is often translated into English as emptiness, but which is more precisely rendered as the absence of inherent self-existence. The translation matters because the simpler word emptiness in English suggests something close to nothingness, an absence that is the opposite of being. This is exactly the wrong way to read the Madhyamaka teaching. Shunyata does not mean that things do not exist. It means that things do not exist independently. They exist relationally, dependently, in mutual constitution with everything else. The cup exists as a cup only because of the clay, the shaping, the firing, the use, the perceiver, and the entire web of conditions that brought it into being and that sustain its current configuration. None of these elements is the cup, and the cup is not separable from any of them. The cup is empty of independent self-existence. The emptiness is what allows the cup to be a cup at all. This is, when grasped properly, a profound philosophical claim. It is not the claim that the world is illusory in the sense of unreal. It is the claim that the world is real precisely as a network of mutually dependent arisings, and that nothing within the network has the kind of self-contained substantial existence that ordinary perception attributes to it. Nagarjuna developed this claim through a series of dialectical analyses, applying it to motion, time, causation, the self, the elements, the Buddha, nirvana, and many other concepts. In each case, he showed that close analysis dissolves the apparent self-existence of the analyzed object into a pattern of mutual constitution that has no independent center. The argument is not nihilistic. The argument is constructive. What it constructs is a picture of reality in which everything that exists by virtue of its relationships, and the relationships themselves are what is most fundamental. The substrate, in this analysis, is not a thing. The substrate is the structure of mutual dependence, the pattern of dependent origination that gives rise to all the things that we encounter in experience. The Madhyamaka teaching distinguishes between two truths. There is the conventional truth, the level at which it is true to say that the cup exists, that I am sitting at a table, that there are rivers and mountains in the world, and there is the ultimate truth, the level at which everything that exists conventionally is empty of inherent self-nature. The two truths are not opposed. They are two ways of looking at the same situation. From the conventional standpoint, things appear and function as relatively stable centers of identity. From the ultimate standpoint, the same things are seen to be patterns of dependent arising, lacking any independent essence to be the thing in itself. Nagarjuna's claim was that both truths must be held together. To deny the conventional truth is nihilism. To deny the ultimate truth is the deepest form of confusion. To see the conventional truth as resting on the ultimate truth is what Madhyamaka calls the middle way, the path that avoids both the extreme of substantialist affirmation and the extreme of nihilistic denial. The most widely read expression of this insight in the Buddhist literature is the short text known as the Heart Sutra, composed sometime around the 5th century of the Common Era and central to East Asian Mahayana practice. The text records a teaching by the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara to the disciple Sariputra, in which the deepest insight of the perfection of wisdom is condensed into a series of paradoxical formulations. The most famous of these states that form is not different from emptiness, and emptiness is not different from form, that what we encounter as manifested existence and what we recognize on deeper analysis as the absence of inherent self-existence are not two separate things, but two aspects of a single reality. The same insight is then applied across the entire field of Buddhist categories, with the sutra declaring that the various components of psychological experience, the modes of consciousness, the elements of the classical analysis of mind, and even the central teachings of the Buddha himself are all empty in this same sense. The text is short, but the philosophical implications are immense. What it asserts is that there is no level of analysis at which independent, self-existing things will be found. The whole of reality, all the way down, is the play of mutually constituting patterns within a substrate that itself has no fixed nature. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition, which inherited the Madhyamaka analysis through translation and elaboration starting in the 8th century, took these insights into their own distinctive practical and philosophical developments. The teacher Tsongkhapa in the 14th century produced extensive commentaries that became foundational for the Gelug school. The Dzogchen tradition, with roots claimed to extend much earlier, but with its main literary and practical development in the centuries from the 8th onward, refined the Madhyamaka insight into a teaching about the nature of awareness itself. The view associated with Dzogchen is that awareness, what the tradition calls Rigpa, has two inseparable aspects. There is the empty nature of awareness, its lack of any fixed substantial form, and there is the luminous knowing aspect of awareness, its capacity to recognize and engage with whatever arises. These two are not separable. In the Dzogchen analysis, they are aspects of a single recognition. To know awareness is to know it as empty and luminous together. The emptiness is not nothing. The emptiness is what allows the luminous knowing to be the kind of thing it is. The structural parallel to the modern physical picture, in which the vacuum is empty of localized matter but full of the activity that produces matter, is striking. Just as the physical vacuum is the empty substrate from which the patterns of manifested existence emerge, the awareness of Dzogchen is the empty substrate from which the patterns of mental and perceptual experience emerge. The Taoist tradition of ancient China articulated a structurally similar insight through entirely different conceptual machinery, and in many ways, the convergence with modern physics is even more direct in the Taoist case than in the Buddhist. The Tao Te Ching, composed sometime in the 6th or 5th century before the Common Era and attributed traditionally to the sage Lao Tzu, is, among other things, a sustained meditation on the creative function of emptiness. The text returns to this theme in many chapters, developing it with an aphoristic compactness that has made these passages central to East Asian thought for 2.5 millennia. The 4th chapter describes the Tao itself as something that is empty, yet inexhaustible in its functioning, a deep pool from which all things issue forth, and that is never depleted by what comes out of it. The 11th chapter, which has become perhaps the most famous philosophical articulation of emptiness in any tradition, gives a series of concrete examples to make the point. The wheel functions because of the empty hub at its center. The vessel holds because of the cleared space inside it. The room is usable because of the windows and doors that have been cut into the walls. In each case, what is full and substantial is what one ordinarily notices, but what makes the substantial thing functional is the emptiness that the substantial thing surrounds. This is not a small philosophical point. The Taoist tradition treats it as the deepest insight into the nature of how reality is structured. The 40th chapter of the Tao Te Ching puts the insight in its most general form, stating that all the things of the world arise from being, and that being itself arises from non-being. The Chinese terms here, wu and yu, are typically translated as non-being and being, but the technical philosophical meaning is closer to the modern distinction between substrate and manifestation. Wu is not absolute nothingness. Wu is the formless, the unmanifest, the substrate from which manifested things emerge. Yu is the realm of the manifest, the named, the formed. In Taoist metaphysics, Wu is prior to Yu. The substrate is what makes manifestation possible. The unmanifested is what makes the manifested what it is. The Tao itself, the deepest source, is described in the tradition as the original Wu, the primordial formless that is the ground of all forms. The implications of this for Taoist practice and thought are extensive. Zhuangzi, the second great Taoist text, traditionally attributed to the philosopher of the same name and composed in the 4th century before the Common Era, develops the implications through stories, parables, and philosophical dialogues. One of the most famous of these is the story of the cook, who carves an ox for his lord. The cook explains that he has not sharpened his blade for 19 years because he never cuts through the meat or the bone. He moves the blade through the empty spaces between the joints, and the ox falls apart effortlessly. The skill of the cook lies in his sensitivity to the structure of emptiness within the apparent solidity of the body. He has learned to find the hollows, the gaps, the openings that the surface appearance does not reveal. His mastery is not over the substantial. His mastery is in his perception of the emptiness within the substantial, and his ability to operate in that emptiness with grace and economy. The story is a parable about contemplative attention, but it is also a precise philosophical statement. What is functionally most important is not what fills space, but what is empty within the space. The action that succeeds is the action that operates in the cleared regions. The substrate of effective practice, like the substrate of cosmic creation, is emptiness. A second image from the Zhuangzi makes the cosmological side of the same insight explicit. The text describes the original condition of being as a kind of uncarved block called pu in the Chinese, a state of formless potential prior to the cuts and distinctions that produce the world of named things. Carving begins and forms emerge. The forms are real, but they are configurations of the deeper formlessness, not independent entities standing on their own. The wisdom of the sage, in this account, is to keep contact with the uncarved condition even while operating among the carved. The carving does not destroy the block. The block remains beneath every form that has been cut from it, ready to support new forms when the old ones have dissolved. This is, in the language of substrate and manifestation, exactly the picture that contemporary physics has arrived at. The substrate is the uncarved, the manifested world is the carved. The carving does not deplete the substrate. The substrate continues to be what it is, supporting whatever patterns happen to be active at any given moment, indifferent to the particular forms that arise within it. The Taoist intuition, articulated in this story and many others throughout the literature of the tradition, is that one becomes wise to the extent that one stops trying to push against the substantial and learns instead to move with the structure of the empty. This is the same intuition, expressed in practical and ethical terms, that the modern physical picture has arrived at in its description of fields, vacuum, and substrate. The deep order is not in the things. The deep order is in the field within which the things arise. The Hindu tradition approached the same set of questions through a different vocabulary, but reached structurally parallel conclusions. The earliest articulation in the Vedic literature appears in the invocation that opens the Isha Upanishad, one of the principal Upanishads composed sometime before the 5th century, before the Common Era. The invocation, in its compressed Sanskrit form, makes a claim about the relationship between fullness and emptiness that has been studied and commented on by Vedantic teachers for the better part of 3 millennia. The claim, paraphrased rather than quoted, is that what appears as the manifest universe and what underlies it as the deeper reality are both fullness, that fullness emerges from fullness, and that even when fullness is taken from fullness, fullness remains. This is not a paradox to be resolved. It is a precise philosophical formulation of the relationship between the substrate and the manifest. The substrate, called Brahman in Vedantic terminology, is not depleted by what emerges from it. The manifest world, called the universe of names and forms, draws its fullness from the fullness of the substrate, but the substrate is not diminished by the drawing. The structure is exactly the structure that modern physics describes when it speaks of fields whose ground state is undisturbed by the excitations that propagate through them. The field is not depleted by the particles it produces. The substrate is not lessened by the world it gives rise to. Both can be full, without the manifest being a subtraction from the substrate. The Vedantic tradition developed a precise method for approaching this substrate, called neti-neti, not this, not this. The method appears most prominently in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where the sage Yajnavalkya teaches the practitioner that the deepest reality cannot be captured by any positive description. Whatever you say it is not that. The substrate exceeds every category of the manifest, because the manifest emerges from it. To approach the substrate is to systematically negate every concept the surface mind can form, recognizing that none of them captures what is being approached. This is not a denial of the substrate's reality. It is an acknowledgement that the substrate's reality is of a different order from the reality of the things that derive from it. The categories that apply to manifested phenomena do not apply, in the same way, to what makes manifested phenomena possible. The tradition distinguishes between Brahman with attributes, which is how the substrate appears when approached through positive concepts, and Brahman without attributes, which is the substrate as it is in itself, prior to any of the conceptual structures that attempt to describe it. The deeper reality is the latter, and the latter cannot be captured in language without distortion. It can only be approached through systematic negation, through silence, through the recognition that what is most fundamental cannot be made into an object of thought without ceasing to be what it is. The Hindu cosmological literature also developed a more concrete vocabulary for the substrate in the concept of Akash. Akasha is sometimes translated as space and sometimes as ether, but neither translation quite captures what the term refers to in Vedantic and later traditions. Akasha is the first of the elements in classical Hindu cosmology, the most subtle and the most pervasive, from which the more concrete elements of air, fire, water, and earth are said to derive. It is the substrate within which all phenomena unfold, and it is itself almost emptiness, almost not a thing at all, but it is the precondition for there being any things. The structural parallel to the physical vacuum, the empty substrate from which the more concrete phenomena of matter and energy emerge, is direct. Akasha is what fills empty space in the Vedantic picture, and what fills empty space is what makes everything that is not empty space possible. The Christian contemplative tradition arrived at structurally similar insights through what is, by the standards of contemplative inquiry, a relatively short historical development. The early articulations are found in the writings attributed to Dionysius the Areopagite, a body of work produced in the late 5th or early 6th century by an anonymous author who took the name of a figure mentioned in the New Testament. The author of these writings, now commonly called Pseudo-Dionysius, developed in his treatise The Mystical Theology a systematic method for approaching the deepest layer of reality through what came to be called the via negativa. The method proceeds through systematic negation, similar in structure to the Vedantic neti-neti. The deepest reality, Pseudo-Dionysius wrote, is not body, is not soul, is not intellect, is not being, is not goodness, is not divinity, in the sense in which divinity can be conceived. The negations are not denials of the reality of what they negate. They are recognitions that the deepest reality exceeds the categories used. To say of the source that it is good, in the way the things derived from it are good, is to put the source on the same level as its derivatives, which falsifies the relationship. The proper response is to negate the affirmation, recognizing that the source is good in some way that exceeds the goodness it bestows on what comes from it. And then, in the most challenging move of the apophatic method, even the negations must be negated. The source is not the not good. The source exceeds even the negation of the categories that derive from it. What is left, when this systematic process is followed to its conclusion, is what Pseudo-Dionysius called the divine darkness, a region of approach that is beyond every concept the discursive mind can form. This apophatic framework was developed and refined across the Christian Middle Ages by a long succession of contemplative theologians. Maximus the Confessor in the 7th century integrated apophatic insights into a comprehensive Christian metaphysics. John Scotus Eriugena in the 9th century translated Pseudo-Dionysius into Latin and developed the implications further. The anonymous English author of the 14th century work The Cloud of Unknowing produced one of the most accessible articulations, written for a beginner in the contemplative path. The cloud of the title is the cloud of unknowing that stands between the soul and the deepest reality, a cloud that cannot be penetrated by thought but only, the author insists, by love. The discursive mind has to surrender its grasping for concepts and rest in a kind of attentive unknowing if it is to approach what is beyond all concepts. The text is practical rather than theoretical. It is a manual for the contemplative aspirant, but the metaphysical framework it presupposes is the apophatic framework that runs through the entire Christian mystical tradition. The most radical and philosophically demanding development of these insights in medieval European thought came from Meister Eckhart, the German Dominican, who lived from approximately 1260 to 1328, and who taught and preached in Latin and Middle High German across the German-speaking lands. Eckhart's contribution was to push the apophatic insight to its logical limit and to articulate a distinction that proved too radical for the church authorities of his time. The distinction was between Gott, God, in the ordinary theological sense, the personal God of prayer and revelation, and Gottheit, the Godhead, the deeper layer that, in Eckhart's analysis, lies beyond God in his manifested aspect. Gott is the God who creates, who acts, who relates to creatures, who is the proper object of religious devotion. Gottheit is the silent ground from which Gott emerges, the abyss within which even the personal God arises as a manifestation. Eckhart used various terms for this deeper layer, including the desert, the wilderness, the silent wasteland, and most strikingly, das Nicht, the nothing. By the nothing, Eckhart did not mean absolute absence. He meant what is not anything, what cannot be located among the categories of being, what is the source of being, and therefore prior to it. Gottheit, in Eckhart's preaching, is the nothing that makes everything possible. It is to Gott what Gott is to creatures, and the soul, in its deepest part, what Eckhart called the spark or the little ember of the soul, the Vunkelin, is in direct contact with this Gottheit, prior to any of the structures of thought, will, or feeling that ordinarily constitute the conscious self. These claims were investigated for heresy during Eckhart's lifetime, and a number of his propositions were condemned by Pope John XXI in 1329 after Eckhart's death. The condemnation drove Eckhart's writings underground for centuries, but they were preserved by Dominican copyists and by readers within and outside the order, and they have been studied seriously by philosophers, theologians, and historians of thought ever since. What Eckhart pushed for, and what got him in trouble, was the recognition that the deepest layer of reality cannot be assimilated to the personal God of ordinary religious imagination. It is something more fundamental, something from which even the personal God arises as a manifested aspect, something that exceeds every category that ordinary religious language deploys. This is, in its way, exactly the kind of claim that the apophatic tradition had always implied, but Eckhart spelled it out with a directness that made the implications impossible to ignore. The Christian tradition also articulated a complementary insight, distinct from but related to the apophatic framework, in the concept of kenosis. The term comes from the Greek of the New Testament, specifically from a passage in the letter to the Philippians, attributed to the Apostle Paul. The passage states that Christ, though existing in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. The Greek verb here is ekenosin, from which the noun kenosis derives. The theological tradition that developed this concept, beginning in the patristic period and extending through the Reformation and into modern theology, treats kenosis as the fundamental movement of the divine. Whatever else God is, on this view, God is the kind of reality that empties itself in order to give rise to other realities. The act of creation, on a kenotic theological reading, is itself a divine self-emptying. God makes room for creation by withdrawing, by limiting, by emptying out the divine plenitude in such a way that finite created beings can come into existence. The pattern of dying and rising that the tradition sees in the life of Christ is, on this reading, a particular instance of the more general pattern of divine kenosis that runs through all of God's relationship to the created world. The Jewish Kabbalistic tradition developed a closely related insight in its concept of tzimtzum, articulated most fully by Isaac Luria in the city of Safed in the 16th century. Luria, building on the older Kabbalistic tradition of the Zohar and on his teacher, Moses Cordovero, proposed that creation could not be understood as God making something out of nothing in an external space. There was no external space prior to creation. God was everywhere, fully, without remainder. For there to be anything that was not God, God had to first contract, to withdraw, to make a cleared region within the divine plenitude where finite creatures could exist. This act of contraction, called tzimtzum, was the fundamental cosmological event in the Lurianic system. The void that resulted from the contraction was not absolute nothing. It was the cleared field within God where created things could come into being. Creation, in the Lurianic Kabbalah, occurs within an emptiness that is itself the result of divine self-limitation. The kenotic pattern in Christian theology and the tzimtzum doctrine in Lurianic Kabbalah are not identical. They emerge from different traditions and serve different theological purposes. But the structural insight they share, that the creative act involves a primary emptying, a withdrawing, a making of room, points to the same recognition that the contemplative traditions have approached in their various ways. Manifestation requires emptiness. The fullness of finite being arises within a substrate that has the character of cleared space, of withdrawn plenitude, of an emptiness that is itself the precondition for there being anything finite at all. The Islamic tradition contributed its own articulations of these insights, particularly in the mystical Sufi development that flourished from the 8th century onward. The Quran itself contains several passages that have been the basis for contemplative reflection on the relationship between divine fullness and the apparent emptiness of the manifest world. The passage at chapter 67 verse 3 declares that you will see no flaw in the creation of the Most Merciful, no fissure or crack in the apparent perfection of the divine ordering. The implication, drawn out by centuries of tafsir and mystical commentary, is that what appears to ordinary perception as empty space, as the unfilled gap between things, is itself part of a divine ordering whose perfection extends through the apparent voids as much as through the apparent fullnesses. The Sufi tradition built on this and similar passages to develop a systematic vocabulary for the contemplative life. The concepts of fana, annihilation in God, and baqa, subsistence in God after annihilation, structure the Sufi path. The seeker empties the surface ego of its particular contents in order to make room for the divine presence to manifest through the cleared space. The fana is not the destruction of the seeker, it is the withdrawal of the surface ego in order to allow what is deeper to come forward. The pattern is structurally similar to the Lurianic Tzimtzum, applied at the level of the individual contemplative's interior rather than at the level of cosmology. The teaching of the great philosophical Sufi Ibn Arabi, who lived from 1165 to 1240 and developed the doctrine of Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of being, took these insights into a comprehensive metaphysical framework in which all of finite existence is the manifestation of divine attributes within the cleared field of created possibility. What emerges across these various traditions, despite their profound differences in cultural setting, theological commitment, and practical orientation, is a structural recognition that has clear parallels to what modern physics is now articulating in its own technical vocabulary. The deepest layer of reality is not a thing among the things that derive from it. The deepest layer cannot be described in the categories that apply to its derivatives. The deepest layer is, in the various contemplative vocabularies, an emptiness that is also the source of every fullness, a silence that is also the origin of every utterance, a cleared space that is also the precondition for there being any locus of being at all. The contemplative traditions did not arrive at these insights through measurement. They arrived through sustained attention to the structure of being itself, through practices that took generations to refine, and what they found, when they pushed inquiry to the deepest level it could reach, has structural similarities to what physics is now describing through entirely different methods. The vacuum of modern physics, the substrate of holographic encoding, the entanglement structure that gives rise to spacetime itself, is being approached from outside through measurement and theory toward the same territory that the contemplative traditions have been approaching from inside through attention. The convergence is not equivalence. The Madhyamaka analysis of dependent origination is not identical to the ADS, CFT correspondence. The Lurianic doctrine of Tzimtzum is not the same as the Higgs mechanism. The Eckartian distinction between Gott and Gottheit is not the same as the relationship between manifest and substrate in modern field theory. Each tradition is doing its own work, with its own commitments, in its own context. What they share is the recognition that the deepest layer of reality is not capturable in the categories of the surface, that it requires a different vocabulary, that it has the character of an emptiness, which is also the most full thing there is. And this recognition, taken seriously, changes the character of the inquiry that any particular tradition is engaged in. The physicist who recognizes that the vacuum is not nothing but the most active substrate in the universe is doing structural work that has been done before, in different vocabularies, by Nagarjuna, by Lao Tzu, by Pseudo-Dionysius, by Eckhart, by Luria, by Ibn Arabi. The deepest inquiry is, finally, the same inquiry, conducted from different sides. What this means for the morning person reading these words, what implications follow when these convergences are taken seriously, what relationship can be lived with the substrate that both contemplative tradition and modern physics are pointing toward, is the question that the next inquiry will pursue. The structural picture is now in place. The body of contemplative analysis has been laid out alongside the body of physical analysis. What remains is to ask what all of this means, finally, for the particular configuration of substrate that is reading these words, and that will, in time, dissolve back into the deeper layer from which it temporarily emerged. The most fundamental fact about your existence is that you are not standing on nothing. You are not surrounded by nothing. You are not, when the analysis is followed to the deepest level it can reach, separable from the substrate that holds and supports and produces the pattern that you are. The empty space between the atoms of your body, the empty space between you and the wall, the empty space between the Earth and the Moon, and the most distant galaxy is not empty. It is the most active, the most informationally rich, the most generative state of physical reality that any inquiry has yet uncovered, and the substrate from which both your body and the apparent emptiness around it emerges, in some sense that physics is still working to articulate and that contemplative traditions have been pointing at for thousands of years, the deepest layer of what is real. This is the situation we now have to face, not as an abstraction but as the most personal fact about being alive. You are a configuration of substrate. The substrate is not depleted by your existence, and the substrate, whatever it is what makes you possible at the most fundamental level. The picture that has been developing across the inquiries of the past several centuries, from the early articulations of zero-point energy to the modern frameworks of holographic information and emergent spacetime, has now reached a point where its convergence with what the major contemplative traditions have been articulating for millennia is too striking to dismiss as coincidence. Both inquiries, working from entirely different starting points and with entirely different methods, point toward the same structural recognition. The manifest world is not foundational. The manifest world is a particular pattern of organization within a substrate that is itself the deeper reality from which all patterns emerge. Whether one calls this substrate the quantum vacuum, the implicate order, the field of fields, Shunyata, the Tao, Brahman, the Godhead, the Ein Sof, or simply the unmanifest source, the structural function of the concept across these various frameworks is the same. It is what makes manifestation possible. It is what particular things are in their deepest aspect, and it is, on the convergent witness of physical investigation and contemplative attention, not nothing. Before we draw out what this means for the person reading these words, intellectual honesty requires that we look squarely at the objections to everything that has been argued. The picture we have built is not the only available reading of the evidence, and several alternative views have serious philosophical and scientific defenders. Any account that ignores them is a form of intellectual cheating, and the inquiries of this kind have suffered enough from such cheating to warrant extra caution. The first objection is the most serious from a strictly physical standpoint, and it concerns what physicists call the cosmological constant problem. The vacuum, as it appears in quantum field theory, has an enormous calculated energy density. When physicists try to determine what this calculated energy density implies for cosmology, when they ask how the vacuum's energy should affect the large-scale evolution of the universe, the answers they get are catastrophically wrong. Steven Weinberg at the University of Texas at Austin, in his influential 1989 review of the problem, called it the worst theoretical prediction in the history of physics. The discrepancy between the theoretically calculated vacuum energy density and the value implied by observations of the accelerating expansion of the universe is, depending on how the calculation is performed, somewhere between 55 and 120 orders of magnitude. This is not a small disagreement. This is a disagreement so large that it indicates we do not yet understand something crucial about how the vacuum interacts with gravity at the largest scales. The vacuum is real on this objection. The vacuum has measurable effects in the laboratory, but its behavior at cosmological scales has features that exceed our current ability to model. Any framework that confidently rests metaphysical conclusions on the vacuum has to acknowledge that the underlying physics is, at the most fundamental level, incomplete. This objection is correct. The cosmological constant problem is real and unresolved. Several frameworks have been proposed to address it, including anthropic considerations within the multiverse, modifications to quantum field theory at very low energies, and conjectures about deeper structure that current theory has not yet revealed. None of these proposals is settled. What this means for our inquiry is not that the picture of vacuum as substrate is wrong, but that the picture is incomplete. We can confirm the vacuum's activity in laboratory experiments. We can measure its effects with extraordinary precision, but our ability to articulate what the vacuum is, at the deepest level, is limited by the unresolved problems at the boundary of current physics. The honest position is to acknowledge this rather than to overstate what is known. A second objection comes from a different direction and concerns the popular misuse of these ideas. The recognition that the vacuum is full of activity, that consciousness has structural features that map onto quantum frameworks, that ancient traditions describe something resembling what physics now articulates, has been seized upon by various popularizers to make claims that the underlying physics does not support. There are popular books, courses, and frameworks that present the activity of the quantum vacuum as a basis for personal wellness, for manifesting outcomes, for accessing health and abundance through alignment with cosmic frequencies. The leap from rigorous metaphysical inquiry to therapeutic and self-help applications is, in most of these popular treatments, completely unjustified by anything in the physics or in the contemplative traditions being invoked. The traditions did not promise outcomes. The physics does not predict that aligning with the vacuum produces health benefits. The serious work of inquiry into the substrate of being has, in much of the popular space, been collapsed into a marketing apparatus that the original sources would not have endorsed and that the underlying scientific frameworks do not support. This collapse is a real intellectual problem. It does not refute the deeper inquiry, but it requires that the deeper inquiry distance itself from the facile applications. The recognition that the vacuum is the substrate of being is not a recipe for getting what you want. It is a recognition about the nature of what is. The two are different kinds of claim, and conflating them does damage to both. A third objection concerns the convergence claim itself. The fact that physics and various contemplative traditions seem to point towards similar structural pictures might not, the objection goes, indicate genuine convergence at all. It might indicate that the human mind has a tendency to find patterns, and that any sufficiently rich body of contemplative literature can be made to look like it anticipates any sufficiently rich physical theory if the interpreter is sufficiently motivated. The traditions, on this objection, were not doing physics. They were doing something else, and projecting modern physical concepts back onto their work distorts what they were actually saying. The Maldacena analysis of dependent origination, for instance, was a philosophical and soteriological project aimed at addressing specific problems in Buddhist thought, not a proto-quantum field theory. The Taoist concept of Wu was articulated within a particular Chinese philosophical context, not as a precursor to quantum vacuum. The Eckhartian distinction between Goth and Goethite was theological, not metaphysical scientific. To claim convergence across these frameworks risks a kind of imperialism, in which modern physical concepts are taken as the standard against which all earlier inquiries are measured. This objection deserves serious consideration. It is true that the traditions were not doing physics. It is true that they had their own commitments, their own contexts, their own purposes. The claim of convergence has to be carefully circumscribed if it is to mean anything at all. What can be said responsibly is the following. The traditions were doing inquiry into the structure of being. The inquiries used different methods, but they were directed at overlapping questions. What is the most fundamental layer of reality? What is the relationship between manifested existence and what underlies it? Are the categories that apply to ordinary objects also the deepest categories of reality, or do they dissolve under sufficiently careful analysis? Modern physics is also doing inquiry into these questions. The methods are different, but the questions overlap. When two different lines of inquiry, conducted by different methods on overlapping questions, arrive at structurally similar answers, this is at least suggestive. It is not proof of identity. It is not license to collapse the differences, but it is grounds for taking both lines of inquiry seriously as sources of insight into the matter at hand. The structural convergence is real, even if it is not equivalence, and the convergence deserves to be examined rather than dismissed by either the reductionist who wants only physics or the traditionalist who wants only the contemplative authorities. A fourth objection focuses on the category mistake that any cross-domain mapping risks. Physics is in the business of describing structure, prediction, mathematical relationship, measurement. Contemplative traditions are in the business of transformation, recognition, ethical orientation, lived practice. To map concepts across these domains is to risk treating them as if they were the same kind of thing. Even when the structural patterns line up, the function of the concepts within their respective frameworks may be different in ways that matter. The vacuum in physics is something to be calculated and measured. The Godhead in Eckhart is something to be approached in contemplative silence. The cup of tea on the table exists conventionally and is empty of inherent self-existence in Madhyamaka analysis. To treat these as parallel claims about the same kind of object is to lose something essential about what each one is doing. This objection is also correct as far as it goes. The frameworks are not interchangeable. What can be said is that the structural recognition each framework arrives at is a recognition about the same world, even if the function of the recognition differs by framework. The vacuum that physicists measure is the same physical reality that contemplatives have approached through attention to the structure of being. The methods address it differently. The conclusions matter for different reasons, but the underlying reality is one, and the convergence at the level of structure is a convergence about that underlying reality. The danger is real of conflating frameworks. The task is to maintain the differences while acknowledging the structural similarities. Done well, this allows each framework to inform the other without dissolving either into the other. When all of these objections have been weighed, what survives is not a metaphysical certainty but a structural picture that holds up under examination. The substrate is real. The substrate is not capturable in the categories that apply to its derivatives. The substrate is approached from physics through the development of vocabularies that exceed the classical concepts of matter, energy, space, and time. The substrate is approached from contemplative inquiry through vocabularies that exceed the ordinary concepts of self, world, being, and non-being. The two approaches, at the level of structural recognition, are pointing toward the same territory. The honest position is to take both seriously, to maintain their distinctions, and to follow the inquiry where it leads. Where it leads, when followed, has connections to many other strands of inquiry that have been pursued in this larger investigation. The question of why the universe is expanding and what kind of substrate sustains the apparent expansion takes on new dimensions when the substrate itself is recognized as the most active state of physical reality. Whatever is driving the accelerated expansion of the cosmos, whatever produces what cosmologists call dark energy, is in some sense an effect of the same vacuum whose more local effects are measured in the Casimir experiments and in the spectra of atoms. The universe at its largest scale and the universe at its smallest may be expressions of a single underlying substrate whose full character we have not yet articulated. The inquiry into vibration, into the recognition that everything that exists is at some level a periodic excitation of underlying fields, finds its proper home in the picture of vacuum we have been building. Fields are what vibrate. The vacuum is the field at rest. The specific frequencies and amplitudes that constitute particles, atoms, molecules, bodies, stars, are the vibrations of the substrate, and the substrate is what they are vibrations of. When the contemplative traditions speak of an originating vibration, a primordial sound from which the world emerges, they are pointing at something that the physics of fields, when fully articulated, will recognize as a familiar territory. The vibration is not separate from the field. The field is not separate from the vacuum. The vacuum is what it all is, in its undisturbed mode. And the manifested world is what happens when the substrate is excited into the patterns that constitute the things we encounter. The question of how biological systems relate to the substrate also takes on new resonance in this framework. If the vacuum is informationally rich, if the substrate has organizational properties that produce the geometry and matter of the manifest world, then the biological systems that have evolved within this substrate may have developed sensitivities to its structure that go beyond what a more impoverished picture of empty space would suggest. The brain that processes information, the body that converts environmental signals into action, the molecular machinery that organizes living systems, are all themselves configurations of the substrate, and their interactions with the surrounding substrate may carry more depth than classical pictures could accommodate. The notion that biological systems function as antennas for receiving information from the substrate, while remaining speculative in its specific applications, fits naturally into the broader picture of a substrate that has informational content available, in principle, to systems that are configured to access it. The question of what holds the patterns of selfhood across the gaps in conscious experience, the question of what persists when integrated awareness dissolves and what reconstitutes when it returns, finds its broader context in this picture of substrate. Whatever the substrate is, it is what holds patterns when no current excitation is sustaining them. The synaptic configurations of a brain in deep sleep, the molecular structures of a body in rest, the informational patterns that survive the daily disappearance of conscious selfhood are all preserved in something. And whatever that something is, it is structurally the same substrate that holds the rest of the universe together. The continuity of selfhood across sleep, like the continuity of a particle across space, like the continuity of a field across regions where no excitation currently propagates, depends on a substrate whose nature is the deepest question we have been considering. The pattern of manifestation, arising from substrate, dissolving back into substrate, and re-emerging in renewed configurations, runs through every level of the inquiry. The particle that appears from the vacuum propagates, interacts, and decays back into the vacuum. The body that arises from molecular organization lives, dies, and returns its constituent matter to the broader environment. The civilization that emerges from particular conditions flourishes and eventually dissolves. The universe itself that, on certain cosmological models, may have arisen from a vacuum fluctuation and may eventually return to a vacuum-dominated state. The pattern is the same at every scale. Manifestation and dissolution, excitation and rest, form arising from emptiness, and emptiness receiving form back into itself when the form's particular configuration runs out. This is, in the convergent witness of physics and contemplative tradition, the deepest pattern that the universe instantiates. What this picture also clarifies is something that has appeared in many separate contexts of physical inquiry. The recognition that quarks cannot be separated from the broader fields that constitute them, that the apparent independence of particles is an illusion produced by the localized intensity of their excitation patterns, becomes a special case of the more general truth that no manifest configuration is separable from the substrate that supports it. The recognition that distant systems can remain correlated through entanglement in ways that no local hidden variable theory can accommodate, that the connections between things are deeper than spatial separation can capture, becomes a feature of the substrate that connects everything beneath the appearance of separation. The recognition that the original observer of any cosmic event is itself something that requires explanation, that the relationship between observer and observed cannot be fully separated, becomes a question about how local configurations of substrate come to know themselves and the patterns around them. Every one of these inquiries, when followed to its deepest point, encounters the same substrate, the same recognition that the surface of reality is not its foundation, the same insistence that what looks separate is more deeply connected than ordinary perception can register. What this means for the religious and theological dimensions of human experience is profound, and it deserves attention proportional to its weight. The Christian theological tradition has, for 2,000 years, articulated a vision of God as the source of being, as the ground from which all that is draws its existence, as the one in whom all things have their being. The apophatic strand of this tradition has insisted, with increasing rigor across the centuries, that this God cannot be assimilated to the categories of ordinary thought, that what God is exceeds every concept the human mind can form, that the deepest contact with God is in a kind of unknowing that recognizes the inadequacy of any positive description. The picture that physics is now articulating of a substrate that exceeds the categories of its manifestations, that cannot be captured in the language of geometry and matter, because it is what makes geometry and matter possible, has structural parallels to the apophatic theological vision that are difficult to ignore. The God of the apophatic tradition is not a being among other beings. The God of the apophatic tradition is the depth from which all beings emerge, and this depth, according to the long contemplative literature of the Christian East and West, is what is most truly real, with everything that we ordinarily call real being a derivative manifestation that draws its existence from the deeper source. If this convergence is taken seriously, certain things follow about how a Christian believer might understand the daily encounter with the world. The empty space that surrounds you is not the absence of the divine. The empty space that surrounds you is, on this convergent reading, the substrate from which the divine creative activity continually generates manifested existence. The God who is the ground of being is not absent from regions where no created thing happens to be. The God who is the ground of being is what those regions are, in their deepest aspect. The presence is not visible because presence in the ordinary sense is a category that applies to manifested things, and the deepest reality is what makes manifested things possible. To speak of the divine ground is to speak of a presence prior to presence, a fullness prior to fullness, an emptiness in the apophatic sense that is also the deepest plenitude. The Eckhartian recognition that the soul in its deepest part touches not the personal God of religious imagination, but the silent ground from which the personal God arises is, in this framework, a recognition about the structure of being itself, articulated in theological language, paralleled in physical language by the recognition that the vacuum is the substrate from which manifested existence emerges. The Buddhist analysis arrives at a structurally similar recognition through entirely different premises and with entirely different practical implications. The teaching of Shunyata, properly understood, is not a teaching about the non-existence of the world. It is a teaching about the inherent emptiness of every category that attempts to capture the world in fixed, substantial terms. The world is real, but it is real as a network of dependent arisings, not as a collection of independent things. To recognize this, in the Buddhist tradition, is to be liberated from the grasping that binds ordinary consciousness to its self-constructions. The seeker who recognizes shunyata is freed from the compulsion to defend a fixed self, to grasp at fixed possessions, to flee fixed terrors. Everything is empty. The emptiness is the source. The patterns arise and dissolve, and the seeker who has recognized this lives differently, with less clinging, more openness, a kind of release into the actual nature of how things are. The convergence with the physical picture is again structural rather than equivalent. The Buddhist shunyata and the physical vacuum are not the same thing, but the recognition each enables that the surface of reality is not the foundation, that the deepest layer cannot be captured in the categories of the manifest, has parallel implications for how a person might inhabit the world. The Buddhist liberation through recognition of emptiness and the physicist's recognition that the vacuum is the substrate of being are different in their methods and applications, but they each point at a depth that ordinary perception does not capture, and that, when recognized, changes the relationship to ordinary experience. The Taoist tradition, with its concept of Wu, the unmanifest source from which all manifested things emerge, articulates the same recognition in yet another idiom and connects it to a particular practical orientation. The sage of Taoist literature does not push against the world. The sage moves with the underlying flow, finding the empty spaces, operating in the cleared regions where action becomes effortless. The cook who cuts the ox by passing the blade through the joints, the master who has learned to work with the structure of emptiness rather than against the appearance of solidity, has recognized something about how the world is organized that the surface mind does not see. Action that is aligned with the substrate succeeds. Action that ignores the substrate exhausts itself against the surface of things. The Taoist intuition, taken seriously, suggests a practical orientation that the convergent, physical, and contemplative inquiries support. Recognition of substrate produces a different relationship to action, one less driven by the compulsions of the surface ego and more responsive to the deeper structure of how things actually work. The Hindu tradition, with its identification of Atman and Brahman, the deepest layer of self with the deepest layer of reality, articulates the same recognition with a particular emphasis on the personal implication. What you are at the deepest level is what reality is at the deepest level. The local fullness that is your particular configuration of substrate is not separate from the universal fullness that is the substrate as a whole. The mantra of the Isha Upanishad, that the manifest is full and the unmanifest is full, and the full is not depleted by what emerges from it, captures the structural fact in one of its most concentrated forms. You are a fullness arising from fullness. The fullness from which you arise is not lessened by your existence, and the fullness that you are is not other than the fullness from which you came. To recognize this is, in the Vedantic tradition, to come to a kind of peace with one's own existence that the surface ego cannot provide. The fear of dissolution, the fear of losing oneself, the fear of death, all of these arise from identification with the local pattern as if it were the foundation of one's being. To recognize that the foundation is the substrate, that the local pattern is a particular configuration of what is in any case eternal, is to find that the deepest fear had been resting on a misidentification. The Islamic tradition, in the contemplations developed by the Sufi philosophers and saints, articulates a related insight in the framework of devotional surrender. The seeker who recognizes that all of finite existence is a manifestation of divine activity, that the apparent emptiness between things is not the absence of God, but the cleared field within which God's creative work unfolds, comes to a particular relationship with the world that is neither the grasping of the surface ego nor the nihilism of denying that anything is real. Everything is real on the Sufi recognition, but everything is real as a manifestation of something deeper. To live with this recognition is to live with what the tradition calls trust in God, tawakkul, a kind of resting in the underlying reality that the surface activity of the world is, in some sense, always already supported by. The fana that empties the surface ego is not destructive, it is preparatory. What the emptied ego makes possible is the more direct experience of the divine reality that was always there, hidden behind the noise of the surface self. These four religious frameworks, despite their profound differences, converge on a practical orientation that bears on what to do with the recognition that has been the subject of this inquiry. The orientation is not heroic spiritual practice. The orientation is not the assumption of any particular metaphysical commitment. The orientation is simply attention. Attention to what is actually present at every moment. Attention to the silence that underlies sound, to the cleared space within which forms arise, to the substrate that supports every manifestation. This attention does not require belief in any particular framework. It does not require a special technique. It requires only the willingness, occasionally during the day, to notice what is ordinarily unnoticed. There are particular places where the substrate becomes available to ordinary attention. The pause between thoughts, the small intervals in which the discursive mind has not yet generated the next content, is one of these places. Attention turned toward this pause, even briefly, makes available a direct experiential contact with what is ordinarily covered by the noise of cognition. The substrate is present in the pause. The pause is not the absence of mind. The pause is the unmanifested substrate from which the next thought will arise. To rest briefly. In this pause is to rest briefly in what is ordinarily called by various names in the contemplative literature, the silent ground, the cleared field, the unmanifest source. The names differ across traditions. The experiential reality is, for those who have attended to it, broadly the same. The silence beneath sound is another such place. In any environment where sound is occurring, there is a silence within which the sound arises. The silence is not the absence of sound. The silence is the substrate against which sound is recognizable as sound. To attend to the silence as carefully as to the sound is to attend to the substrate as much as to its excitations. The same is true of the empty space within objects. Attention to the empty space within a room, rather than to the furniture that fills it, is an attention to the substrate, rather than to the manifested patterns. None of this requires special equipment, special training, special belief. It requires only the willingness to look at what is ordinarily looked through, to notice what is ordinarily noticed past, to recognize what is ordinarily recognized only as the absence of something more interesting. The traditions converge on this practical instruction not because they are saying the same thing in their full theological elaborations, but because they have all noticed that ordinary attention is structured to overlook the substrate, and that the substrate becomes available to anyone who turns attention toward it. The instruction is simple. Notice the pause, notice the silence, notice the space. The instruction is not promising mystical experiences or transformative breakthroughs. The instruction is offering a redirection of attention that changes, slowly over time, the relationship between the attending self and the substrate that is being attended to. What changes is not the substrate. What changes is the relationship. This is what the inquiry has been pointing toward. Not a doctrine, not a system, not a framework that has to be believed. A recognition. A recognition that what you have been taking for granted as empty space is full. A recognition that what you have been taking for granted as solid surface is configured substrate. A recognition that you are not standing on nothing. You are not surrounded by nothing. You are not, in any meaningful sense that the inquiry has been able to identify, separable from the substrate that holds you. You are a particular pattern of organization within a substrate whose nature exceeds the categories you ordinarily use to describe yourself. The relationship between you and the substrate is the most fundamental relationship of your existence, and it has been there all along, available for attention, waiting for you to notice. What you do with this recognition is up to you. The traditions do not promise easy answers. The physics does not promise certainty about the deepest questions. What is offered, by the convergent witness of multiple lines of inquiry across thousands of years, is the recognition that the deepest layer of reality is not what you have been taking it to be. It is more. It is fuller. It is the source from which everything you are and everything you encounter draws its momentary existence. And it is, in some sense, the inquiries are still working to articulate what you most fundamentally are. The empty space around you is not empty. The room you are in is filled with the same substrate that fills every room and every region of space, including the regions where stars and galaxies are forming, including the regions where life is emerging, including the regions where consciousness is somehow arising from the configurations of matter. You are made of the same substrate. The substrate is not depleted by your existence. The substrate is not exhausted by all the manifestations it produces. The substrate is the inexhaustible source, and you are one of its temporary configurations. This is not a frightening thought. The fear of nothingness, the fear of dissolving into emptiness, the fear that the surface ego carries about its own potential disappearance, has been resting on a misperception. What the surface ego fears as nothingness is the fullest thing there is. What the surface ego fears as dissolution is return to the source from which the surface ego itself emerged. The dissolution is not into nothing. The dissolution is into everything, and the everything is not other than what was always there, holding the surface ego in being throughout its temporary career. When you stop reading these words, the substrate will continue. When the day ends and you fall into sleep, the substrate will continue. When the years run out and the local pattern that has been you dissolves back into its broader environment, the substrate will continue. The substrate has been continuing throughout the entire history of the universe, has been there before any galaxy formed, will be there after every galaxy has burned itself out. And the substrate is what you are made of, what every breath you take is drawn from, what every thought you have arises within. The relationship is not optional. The relationship is the deepest fact of your existence, and the relationship can be attended to, slowly, gradually, with whatever attention you happen to have available, in the small pauses between the louder activities of the day. The substrate has been waiting. It has always been waiting. Not as a person waits, with anticipation, as the silence waits beneath the sound, as the cleared field waits beneath the patterns that arise within it. The waiting is not a temporal waiting. The waiting is the simple availability of what has always been there, prior to every attention that has ever turned toward it, present in every moment, whether or not anyone notices. Tonight, when you lie down, tomorrow, when you open your eyes, the substrate will be what holds you. The substrate will be what you draw your existence from. The substrate will be what makes every breath possible, every thought possible, every encounter with the manifested world possible. You did not create the substrate. The substrate is creating you, in every moment, by sustaining the pattern that you are within the deeper field that you ultimately come from. This is the situation. This has always been the situation. And the recognition of it, when it finally lands, is not an addition to your life, but a recognition of what your life has always been. The void is not empty. The void is the most full thing there is. And what you have been calling yourself is a temporary excitation of that fullness, drawing its existence in every moment from the substrate, returning to the substrate when the particular configuration runs out, never separable from the substrate at any point in the entire arc of its existence. You are made of the deepest reality. You have always been. And what remains, when the recognition of this finally settles, is not anxiety about what you are, but a kind of grateful astonishment at what you have always been part of without ever quite knowing it.